What is up, my ninjas? I'm Strident, and today we are going to talk about a toy line that is very near and dear to me because it helped in my love, it helped solidify my love for DC Comics related action figures. Now, before I get into the details of that, I need to set up how we got to that point. So many of you know me, and you know that I do not fit squarely in any one box. I mean, I guess some people who don't like criticism, constructive or otherwise, might think I'm a hater because I typically do not just fall in line with whatever the popular consensus is. But it's not necessarily for a lack of trying. I just genuinely don't enjoy the same stuff the same way as many do. I just don't follow the populace. I'm not I am not able to conform at all. It's tough because sometimes there are things that I find everybody likes that I don't like, and I end up in my own little box, kind of off to the side, while everyone else is enjoying whatever the thing might be. Case in point, when it comes to various comics and when it comes to various movies, when it comes to music, I tend not to follow what people who fit my description are thought to follow. Let's start with movies. You know, many of you grew up with Star Wars and love Star Wars so much. I grew up with Ultraman. First, you like Indiana Jones. I wasn't a big fan of Indiana Jones because I was reading Doc Savage. I loved Doc Savage when I was a kid. And other pulp novels or pulp characters, like The Phantom. The Phantom was one of my favorites. Matter of fact, when you guys were into Star Wars, I was into tokusatsu in general, which goes all the way back to the 50s. So many of these characters and these concepts that you guys were just kind of getting introduced to from Star Wars were already a regular part of my consumption of pop culture. I guess at that time it wasn't American pop culture, but it was science fiction pop culture, and I was already indoctrinated, so to speak, from that aspect. So I wasn't amazed at that because these were the kind of heroes that I was introduced to, you know, guys who had crazy powers and awesome suits and technology, and big and first and foremost, they already had lightsabers. So I wasn't amazed. Cut to the 80s. All of you guys, and you hear this on forums and different websites that talk about toy collecting, everybody grew up with superpowers as if it was the first and only line that had, the DC characters in it, and everybody has that shared memory or pretends to have that shared memory or whatever. They were okay figures. I wasn't like super blown away, and it was cool though to see all these characters all represented in this format. Don't get me wrong. It was cool. Once I did learn about them, I wanted a few of them. It's just that's just not how things went in my house. But had I gotten a chance to get them, I would have been interested. And as you see here with this isn't my collection. These are just images that I picked up that, kind of display what I'm thinking. Had I been introduced to them at a young age, then I too would have had them kind of displayed like this with my DCUCs, because I do have a large amount of DCUCs, and it was all based on comics and such that I was reading, as a kid growing up. But, like I said before, I don't fit into those boxes very easily. Instead, my life took a different turn when it comes to this collection, and I was introduced later to the Total Justice line. The line just completely blindsided my brother and I. It blindsided actually my mom and my sister, and that's what encouraged them to get it for us for Christmas. I want to say the first 2 waves were out, and we had never even seen anything of this line prior to this. And they told us that they had to fight off other people, parents, whatever, to get these, so that, the first 2 lines or waves, so that they could get them for us for Christmas that year, which, if I remember correctly, was 1996. We were in heaven. These guys were awesome. So during the 80s, I was busy playing with Transformers and G.I. Joes and Star Sheriffs and Space Shoguns and, bootleg Ultraman and Kamen Rider figures and He-Man and Thundercats. I was not as stuck on my DC superheroes because I was really young. I was born in 79. So the early 80s, I was a tiny little kid, so I had a sprinkling of everything. You know what I mean? I wasn't focused on one thing like many of my fellow collectors happened to be when it came to, DC or Marvel comics. I hadn't learned that there was a struggle there yet. So my 80s were full of learning about all these other things and getting a little bit of everything. And towards the end of the 80s, that's when I started reading comics more hardcore. 1989 hit, and Tim Burton Batman came out, and I was firmly a DC. I had already liked characters like Superman because of the previous movies. I mean, like, who didn't, But like the Flash later on came out, Superman already had his movies, Batman had his. We didn't have anything with Green Lantern or Aquaman. I mean, other than the Super Friends show, the villains that you see in the background, they showed up in Super Friends, but we didn't quite yet have the repertoire that we have by the time this line came out. Now, I had already started collecting some of the Toy Biz Batman figures, and we had the Flash. We didn't have Aquaman yet. We had Superman. We didn't have any of the villains. I think I might have had Robin. He had that weird chop. Because if you remember correctly, some of those figures were reuses of the Superpowers collection, namely Superman and Batman and the Flash. I didn't have Hawkman yet. I didn't have Black Lightning. I don't. As far as I knew, they didn't exist in toy format. Huntress didn't exist. But I was reading comics about these characters. Freaking Connor Hawk definitely didn't exist yet because he hadn't even been created. But this line in general, it was a Batman line. It was kind of like a gateway to the Justice League. As you can see, Batman, being that it's his line, I did a custom cape job on this figure too because his cape was obnoxious. But this line was a Batman line, so he got two offerings. This black suit you're seeing was more of the modern one. This was the second offering. So he's wearing kind of the No Man's Land black suit underneath it, or the Keaton Bats black suit underneath it. And it's called Fractal Armor Batman. It's somewhat inspired by Alien vs. Predator. He's got the shoulder-mounted cannon and everything. But the idea of this whole line was that Martian Manhunter and Batman would team up to work on a project that would increase the powers of the Justice League so that they could stop the constant invasions that were happening. I showed you a little bit more details on the cape. I will go into more detail on each of the characters so you can see them in their armor, probably as a whole, and then you can see them as figures by themselves, because that's the main draw here. When you see them as figures by themselves, they're just unlike all the other figures that were out at the time. I mean, Toy Biz was still giving us those stiff sculpts where they're standing up just straight with no kind of dynamism or anything, whereas these guys were in poses looking like they're ready to strike. It was a gift and a curse because sometimes the poses were too dynamic and you couldn't really, do too much with them. I mean, we found a way, but, posing them and getting them to stand would be difficult. And, you'd see other lines follow suit. But I was a fan of the Dark Knight collection, so I had a pretty decent sized Batman collection, and I enjoyed the shit out of them. I mean, they were really quality figures. They're sturdy figures. Some of the sturdiest figures I have. I still have them today. Vehicles, figures, the whole nine, the good guys and the bad guys. So it was cool when these popped up, They became more of the gateway into the comic book canon proper. You know what I'm saying? Like beefed up characters, beefed up proportions, more comic book oriented style and comic book oriented design. You know what I mean? Even the gimmick, it was all comic book, Those of you who've been with me for a long time, you know how much I can't stand gimmicks. Lines like Thundercats and the various Toy Biz lines, especially like X-Men and their Marvel superhero lines, they were just fraught with fucking gimmicks. And they were gimmicks that usually broke your ability to play with the figure freely. You know what I mean? Because like if the spring-loaded action busted, then that arm would be limp. You know what I'm saying? Or it was an action that was so invasive that it got in the way of how you play with that figure if you want to ignore the gimmick. So when I saw the type of gimmick that this line had, it made me extremely happy. But I want to stress first, just from looking at these figures, I was more geeked about the figures themselves because they look like what I was reading at the time. I mean, all these suits were their 90s suits. I mean, they had Tim Drake, and Tim Drake had just been, introduced earlier in the 90s. Superman, he's front and center with the mullet because he had just come back from the dead not too long before this. So it was dope to see all these characters represented in a way that it felt like it was current, and it was relevant. That's the better word. It was relevant to what we were collecting or what we were watching and reading in our comics. I mean, not so much with the films. I shouldn't say watching, but more like when you're reading comics. A lot of these events, like the death of Superman and shit, that was on the news. Nightfall. They mentioned some of this stuff on the news, letting you know that certain characters were out of commission and you were going to see a change in the books. So it was nice to see a line that paid attention to the continuity of the comics. Because, as you see now, continuity's gone out the fucking window. And we don't really have that kind of continuity going on all across, Marvel Comics or DC Comics. The closest we have is the MCU, actually. The MCU is all continuity for the film. So if you're into that, it's pretty consistent, There are retcons, but it's pretty consistent. DC might be going in that same direction because they're finally getting their shit together. But here, I was super geeked. But I'm going to go into some detail real quick. Let's look at the Flash. So the Flash had one of the best armors in this line. So their armors all across the board were called fractal armors. I like that idea because that means they kind of pop up like a construct with like probably a prismatic effect. Most of the plastics on the first wave, most of them I want to say, Superman's was like that, Batman's, Green Lantern's, Aquaman's, and I think that's it as far as people who had armor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. Oh, and the Flash. They all had this pearlescent kind of shine to it. Like if you get close up on the armor, you can see the little, crystalline flecks inside there. But as you can see, it's like a visualization of how he moves with those stabilizers in the back. He has those little generator things on his legs that mimic the wings on his legs. We used to always pretend those were the time dilators from Batman the Animated Series that the Clock King stole. You remember those? So it would slow time, which would also help him move faster. I mean, they were stupid powerful, but in my eyes, the inhabitants of Apocalypse were always stupid powerful too. So we had them rely on things like that. I mean, you got to admit, design-wise, this is a dope design. I mean, it's cheesy in the fact that his back is wide open, but I mean, then again, you're not going to display him from the back. You know what I'm saying? But and then fast forward several years, you look at some of the designs that were in the first Injustice, and this is like masterpiece level right here. But it is a combination of some of those Elseworld armors that he's had, and it was dope. It was awesome. My brother loved this armor. He used it all the time. He was more of a Flash fan than I was. I was a fan of the comics. He was a fan of the TV show more than anything. So you see what the gimmick is, essentially. You clip all the pieces on. The armors all have little, slightly different in-universe functions than just protecting them. But everybody had some kind of amp up, except for the villains. The villains all had, like, weapons and tools to use. You know what I'm saying? But you look at the Flash; he just looks amazing. Aquaman's kind of weird. Um, Huntress just has kind of a vest, and she had a giant like crossbow thing. I just didn't like that. So you know me, I don't like shooters. It was more of a gimmick. And then I lost Connor Hawk's stuff. He had like a helmet that helped him aim. But you know, all this took these regular characters, these regular classic characters, and turned them into these powerhouses. And I thought that was dope. You know, it made them stand out. Now, some of the characters had better gimmicks, you know, tied into their armor than others. I felt like there were more than a few of them that just had armor, and the in-universe explanation for the armor was that it enhanced their strength and sometimes their speed, and it protected them from higher power leveled villains and their, you know, attacks and such like that. You know what I mean? So, you know, characters like Robin, he just got extensions that at one point had blades on them. I used the blades for a custom because I never thought I'd be doing this. This is just funny. But people like Green Lantern, you know, he just makes constructs, so those don't really amp up what he does. I think the power output was supposed to be more, you know, increased when he had his armor on. Batman, it was armor, but he could fly. You know what I mean? Because you can see his cape moved up, and they're separated, so they're wings now. I thought the wings weren't handled that well, but I mean, for the time, all you needed was the idea, and then that was perfect. Black Lightning, everything increased his powers, but Superman, his was odd because he had those solar panels on the sides that absorb and reflect energy, and they shoot it out into this kryptonite ray. So it was like, so is the kryptonite ray something that was tweaked to hurt your enemies, or what? Because it's kryptonite. You know what I mean? Kryptonite is Superman's weakness, not Darkseid's weakness. So I always thought that was strange. We used to pretend that it absorbed energy and reflected it 10 times over, you know? But I just was happy to see a new Superman. And this toy was sturdy. When I tell you that we had him punch through styrofoam, cardboard boxes, you know, punch other less sturdy build, other figures of a less sturdy build, and he shattered them. I'm not bullshitting you. This Superman performed like a true man of steel. He destroyed the opposition, you know, at least crippled the opposition. Um, One thing that I have to say though, and I've already said it, I'm just going to reiterate, is I can't stress how some figures were corny and poorly done as far, or their gimmick was corny and it didn't really have a quality in-universe explanation, and it just made for, like, you know, extra shit to put on your character, you know, like Connor Hawk doesn't really need something to make him a better archer, you know what I mean? um, Hawkman doesn't need giant claws to be a cooler Hawkman. You know, oftentimes I would separate the arms from the armor and just pretend it was armor and give him, you know, some other weapon to use. You know, some blades or something like that, because he's supposed to be a really awesome fighter. Aquaman, his was weird, and he also had this real big missile launcher thing that goes on his fist, and it was stupid because what's that going to do? You know what I mean? He's a fighter. He needs to be able to fight. You would have thought they would have given him something involving his trident. I don't know. You know, instead you gave him the 3 prongs on his shoulder to kind of take the place of the trident. Flash was superbly done, from, you know, the design aesthetic to just what the design opens up the character to possibility wise, because you had parts that look like things that existed in other parts of the DC universe, and putting them together on the Flash's armor is dope. But you know, and Huntress had more armor, but it's easy to say, just out of the whole bunch, Hawkman got the short end of the stick. His armor is weak. His design, I mean, the armor looks cool, but the design of the whole thing is just, it's just weak. Capture claws, nah. You need to give a powerhouse fighter weapons to allow him to fight even better. Those are cumbersome. They take up too much space. They just weren't that great. So yeah, sorry Hawkman. You got the shit end of the stick when it came to these guys. But as a whole, just dope. So let's start with Superman. I know it's a Batman line, but Superman needs to be done right in any line that he is offered in, and this was no different. I mean, you can see there's been some aging of the plastic, and the color has kind of faded in areas and darkened in others. But I mean, it is, and you know, sorry he's so dirty. I mean, this is an old ass figure that I had just kind of sitting on a shelf, but it's Superman. I mean, with the mullet, but Superman nonetheless. And I love it. I mean, they even got that detail that so many modern Superman figures don't have. The S on the back, you know, on his cape. It's nice. I mean, it's not like super detailed, it's super amazing, you know, but it's there. It's an S. You can see it. And it's been through enough battles to have earned that wear and tear that you see there. Now, at first, I was planning on not doing much Batman here. I know it's a Batman line, but he seems to get way too much attention. But it only makes sense that, you know, we pay attention to Batman. So the first Batman that we got, the glider wings, it's beautiful. Well done figure. It's kind of modern for the time because he still had the trunks back in those days, but this figure does not have the trunks, which I like. He also has the bands around his wrists, kind of, or forearms, kind of harkening back to the film versions of Batman, and I dig that. Once again, no trunks. I can't really like stress that enough, how they did it here well before it became a thing in the comics. And I know some artists did it differently. He also had buckles and straps on his boots, so you see that they're functional. And he had the, at that time, it was one of the two symbols that you often saw, but this was more of the classic bat symbol, so it was nice. I dug it. Now, of course, I got to go to the other bat suit. We got a second bat suit in the form of this kind of Wildstorm-ish, Witchblade-ish, No Man's Land Batman suit. So this was the black suit. It's kind of reminiscent of Keaton Bats, definitely reminiscent of No Man's Land, because that's when he was wearing an all-black suit. At least during this stage in the game. I dug this. I dug it a lot because I always preferred the all-black suit. It was always my thing. This suit was cool because it also had, it harkened back to the Alien or Batman vs. Predator one-shot. It was a fun book, fun story, cool art, but the suit, it simulated the concept of echolocation and bats seemingly being blind. And it looked really good, and it had reflective surfaces, and more importantly, it had the shoulder cannon, if I remember correctly. I could be off on that. It has been a number of years since I've read that book, but I'm pretty sure he had a cannon on his shoulder, or something to reflect the cannon on there. But anyway, I like where this went. You can remove the cannon on the shoulder. Of course, it's the oversized launcher type deal that so many toys came with back in these days. And I'm not a big fan of gimmicks, but it's a simple one. And it's one you could actually use, you know, in your setups, which was pretty cool. So I can't bitch too much about what they did. Paint-wise, the paint is pretty clean. You can tell I used this thoroughly, but all the details are still pretty much there, down to the TJ symbol that is on his right shoulder, or left shoulder actually. It's just a well done, well designed toy. I mean, I don't know how well this would work in like in universe, comic, you know, in the universe, but as far as what the story was for the universe, they said that him and the Martian Manhunter worked on this suit together, and it has abilities, more abilities than the two of them even know, which sounds really bogus, and I hate when when stuff like that happens, but I mean, hey. I took a little bit of time to set that up to give you kind of the idea of why this one was even offered, because I mean it was a Batman focused line, so there was a lot of, Batman got more of the stuff. There was a slant towards more Batman. Plus, he was super popular at the time. I mean, throughout the '90s, Batman saw a stupid rise in his popularity due to all the movies and the animated series. So it kind of was a no-brainer that if you wanted to sell a new gimmick or a new line, if you tie it to Batman, you'd be golden. You know what I'm saying? But like I said, the details were nice. The shoulder-mounted cannon was kind of cool. It's oversized, felt real toyetic. But the detail on this guy was just on another level. I hated the cape, so I gave him a custom cape. You can see it's the length of capes, that standard cloth capes that came with these 5-inch figures. He could hold the shoulder mounted launcher with no problem. There's like a handle sitting on the side, or you could use the peg that is sticking into his shoulder, the shoulder pad over him. But he was pretty cool. I mean, I didn't have any issues with him, and when things really hit the fan, I traded out the glider suit for this, and I mean, it was fun. Both me and my brother had so much fun using it. It kind of sometimes forced me to use this to put him on par with Superman, while wearing this suit. I know it's lame, but it was fun. Robin was offered perfectly, and for those who don't know, this is Tim Drake. This is not Dick Grayson. This was Tim Drake's costume, and this is what separated him from the others. Also, Tim fought with a staff. I know now it's real weird because these days they try to give Dick all of the Tim, ideas and traits, but this is Tim. I tend to get offended at the treatment of Tim Drake in modern canon, modern DC universe canon. And it sucks because he's such a cool, vital character, and he was a nice difference, a nice change to what we had gotten used to with Dick Grayson, who had become Nightwing by this point. And, I wish they would go back and pay attention to this stuff. But yeah, this was cool for me because he was probably my second Tim Drake figure. The first was the Dick Grayson figure from the animated series. This was my first Kyle Rayner figure. This actually belonged to my brother, and then when he stopped enjoying them, I just kept it. But it's pretty accurate. This guy was important because he was a creation, or I want to say he was created by Darryl Banks. The importance of this was Darryl Banks was teaching at the Columbus College of Art and Design, or he left the School of Visual Arts to teach at the Columbus College of Art and Design when I was moving from New York to the Midwest. And I came to the Columbus College of Art and Design to take his class, and by the time I got there, he had moved on again, and he wasn't working at CCAD anymore. But anyway, created by Darryl Banks, has a connection to Parallax because Parallax came about during the time of Kyle Rayner. It's real dope to have him in figure form. Wally West as the Flash. We had watched the TV series, so we were pretty familiar with the character. I had been reading comics of the Flash for a while at this time, and this figure just captured the movement, the freaking wiry kind of nature, the runner physique that the Flash should have. And then he had the big old boots with straps, and they're not big boots, but the treads are big, and I dig that because you'd need that if you're running at the speeds he runs at. Aquaman. This was the Viking age of Aquaman with the hook and everything, and I love it. This is my favorite version of Aquaman. This is what made me on board for what Zack Snyder and company were planning when they cast Jason Momoa. I felt like this is when he did the most. The detail on this figure is superb. I mean, his pose is weird, but the detail on the figure itself is nice. The hook is nice. It's got that little harpoon kind of feel to it. The scaling on his legs looks really good. I mean, it's just, it's Aquaman, undeniably, The pose is kind of, oh, shit, but it's a dope figure, Huntress. This was the first Huntress figure I ever picked up. It's one of the first ones I ever saw. I actually got this at KB Toys here in Columbus, Ohio, and I think I got this my freshman year in college. But she's a pretty dope figure. Very simple, but a lot of details, you know? I like it. I like it a lot. Connor Hawk. This was the first Connor Hawk figure, at least that I can think of. I don't know if DC Direct's version was out. I didn't have it. But this was the first one I had ever saw. And I had a couple comics that were, I think I might even have his first appearance. And I was geeked to have him in my collection. Now that bow is not the one that he came with. That bow comes from the DCUC Green Arrow. And I modified it. That might be one of several that I have. But anyway, Connor Hawk. Black Lightning. The only Black Lightning figure I ever saw. At the time, you know, I didn't know shit about Black Knight Lightning other than his comic book appearances in Superman books and stuff and Justice League books. But I didn't really know much about the character. But I knew that at this time, this was the costume he was wearing. And it was pretty accurate. I dug it. I want to say just a few years before this toy came out, he showed up in this costume, and I liked it. Now this looks like, I want to say this is the Qatar Hall version of Hawkman, the long hair, the alien version, not the reincarnation. I like this one because he looks more savage, more hardcore. You know what I mean? And the wings aren't. You know, a lot of companies have problems with wings. The wings are not like the most posable wings, but they're cool. I mean, they do the job. You know, they don't have any other movement but open and close, open and close. But, you know, you see the detail and everything. It's nice. The metallic finish on that gold helmet is just dope. And the bad guys, you had Despero, who, up to this point, I want to say there weren't that many figures of Despero. I know DC Direct had done one, maybe by this time. But I wasn't aware of DC Direct like that yet. Because, like I said, this was what kind of put me, these figures were what put me in that direction to start looking to really collect and, you know, fill out my ranks with characters that I want and characters that, you know, would be cool to have, you know, to go against other members of the Justice League and such. So yeah, he was cool. Very tough figure. You can tell we played with him a lot. Look at all that chipping and rusting. That's from taking punches and kicks and everything. Darkseid. Now, this was the first Darkseid figure I ever had. You can tell he has some serious wear and tear on his arms, but overall, he kind of stayed in the background for a lot of my childhood, actually, and kind of plotted things from behind the scenes. He does have this giant hook thing, which was frustrating, but it kind of fits, you know, it kind of plays into that Agony Matrix glove thing that he used to wear on one hand. I think he actually wears it on the other hand, but I mean, you know, you can use your imagination. But look at the detail on him. You know, they gave him that texture on his skin so you really feel that he's made of stone. And I dig that. Yeah, Parallax. This was Daryl Banks' creation. He turned Hal Jordan, a bland-ass character, into a maniacal villain named Parallax. And I dug that. I mean, look at the sculpting on this figure. That cape is phenomenal. All the line work and the different, you know, panel lining on his suit, it's phenomenal. There goes the fire truck again, and the ambulance. Look at the paint, that metallic finish, you know, it's just dope on the green. And the sculpting on his face and fingers is just, it's on point, man. It's like there's really nothing to ask, nothing more to ask from this figure. So this line kind of dissolved into another line called JLA, Justice League of America, where essentially they got rid of the gimmick and just gave us every member of the Justice League that they could get their hands on, essentially. Every character they can get the rights to. And Wonder Woman was one of these characters because she had not yet been introduced in the Total Justice line at large. The same goes for Martian Manhunter. And now if you had been reading Justice League, you know he's vital, you know? You need him on the team. You need Wonder Woman on the team. Steel. Steel was another one. What I dug about this is that we had the Steel from that Superman line that Kenner did prior to this, but this was the look that he had after that, you know, in the comics. It was his modern look at the time, and we were like, yes, we need this in our collection, you know? And it was really cool because he was one of many characters that we wanted to add to our collection because, you know, Steel was a supporting character who did a lot of big things during the 90s. I mean, he was birthed in the 90s, you know? He came from Death of Superman, and then he was prominent in the reign of the Supermen, and then he turned into a supporting character for the Superman family years afterwards, so we had to get him. Now, I just want to make clear that even though I'm only showing you 3 figures that were additional figures from the JLA line, they redid everybody. There were multiple Batman figures, multiple Superman figures, Flash, etc. And then they did all the other modern characters that were part of that JLA roster of the 90s. So the point of this video was more of a trip down memory lane, more of me highlighting something that was a big part of my childhood so that I could give you guys kind of an understanding of where I came into my love of the Justice League in toy form. There's this thing that happens online with all these groups and whatnot where everybody gets into this groupthink mode and they all just echo the same stuff, you know? And I can't get down with that. And it would be disingenuous of me as a collector who's talking about the whole process of collecting and, you know, exploring your collection and displaying it as a personal thing. It'd be super disingenuous if I was just like, yeah, I like superpowers too. I mean, it's a cool line, don't get me wrong. I just have no fucking history with it at all, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2. I have Joker and I have Penguin, and we got them at a secondhand at a thrift store because my wife found them. And she was like, do you have these? I'm like, shit, these are old, you know? But I really fell in love with the Justice League in toy form from these figures. Now, granted, by today's standards, these are weird-ass figures because they're so overly muscular, and then they're in these weird straining poses like, ugh, you know what I mean? And they're so just like weirdly positioned in how they stand and very specific. They can only stand a certain way. But, you know, Superman and Batman are on display. Wonder Woman, you know, I don't have her up here, but she's part of it. Like, it's a good representation of the things that, you know, were on point and on display and being pushed in the 90s, you know, as far as DC Comics. It also shows how far ahead of the curve Kenner was before Hasbro ate them up. You know what I mean? And it's a shame because they were trying things that were a little bit different. They're pushing sculpts. They were pushing the gimmicks into a realm that made things easier and more inspiring as far as your imagination once you get a hold of these figures. Because I can't even tell you the amount of crazy ideas and missions and situations we came up with based on this fractal armor concept. It was fun, you know, just something different. So I just wanted to let you guys know a little bit about this line, kind of sing my praises of it, and then go from there. So yeah, this has been a look at Total Justice. I really appreciate you guys sitting down with me and listening to what I have to say about this line. I hope I've enlightened a few of you to this line that you may not have known existed. And for those retro collectors out there, these guys go for super cheap. I was looking today and I found almost the entire line for like $7 or $8 a pop each. You know what I mean? Plus shipping, of course. You could easily get them for for under what, $70, something like that, under $60. So, you know, if you really are looking for this particular line, not the JLA line, this line, the Total Justice line, they're easy to find, and they're a dime a dozen online. It's strange. They're kind of like Cops in the sense that you can find them everywhere. Cops maybe a little bit less so, but you can find them for okay prices. Sometimes Cops get out of hand with prices, but there's not a lot of coverage about these guys. I think there's 1 or 2 other videos on YouTube, and I'm surprised because it was such a good line. So, like I said, that has been my look at Total Justice, and this is my story, and I am sticking to it. As always, thank you for watching and listening to what I had to say, and that is it for me. You guys have been great. Peace outside.